Good day, everyone. I am Charles Michael Querubin, a fourth year AB Philosophy seminarian of the Mission Society of the Philippines. Today, I am presenting to you the philosophical research entitled A Critique on Chalmers' Concept of Virtual Reality in Video Games. Background of the study. In today's society, virtual reality technology has become so sophisticated and has begun to sweep the market with cheaper yet more powerful VR products for consumers to use. Major factors for why VR technology has become famous among users is that it gives the user a feeling of being part of a virtual world. In fact, the Virtual Reality Society defines virtual reality as the term used to describe a three dimensional computer generated environment which can be explored and interacted with by a person. That person becomes part of this virtual world or is immersed within the environment and, whilst there, is able to manipulate objects or perform a series of actions. This immersiveness that VR technology has is precisely why users are hooked to this technology. David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher, writes in his article The Virtual and the Real, stating that virtual reality involves three key elements, namely immersive, interactive, and computer generated. Computer generated is pretty much self explanatory. Interactive means that the user is able to influence, directly or partly, the outcome or progression of the game. Immersive means that the user is given the sense of presence inside the game. According to Chalmers, all present VR technology that satisfies these three elements are what he calls virtual reality proper. Any technology that lacks at least one of these elements, Chalmers calls as virtual world. One study made by Tommy Otzen describes how immersion is also present in video games. He looked at the possible correlation between immersion in video games and the psychological concept called the flow state. The flow state was described by the Hungarian-American psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in 1975 as the optimal experience, and is described as the mental state in which one is fully immersed in an activity which a person is engaged in. One striking proof to the immersiveness of video games is the reality of video game addiction among the youth. According to Csikszentmihalyi, optimal experience involves those occasions where we feel a sense of exhilaration, a deep sense of enjoyment, which we cherish for long and that becomes a landmark in our lives. Statement of the problem. This study aims to investigate on and answer the following questions. Number 1. What is immersiveness in virtual reality? Number 2. What is David Chalmers' concept of immersiveness in virtual reality? Number 3. What could be the critique on Chalmers' concept of immersiveness in virtual reality? This study claims that Chalmers is mistaken in thinking that immersion is an exclusive property of virtual reality proper and that this characteristic cannot be experienced in a non-3D media of video games. Theoretical framework, conceptual framework. This research will use David Chalmers' concept of virtual reality as written in his article The Virtual and the Real. Chalmers' concept of virtual reality involves three elements which are immersive, interactive, and computer generated. This study will investigate on the immersive facet of his concept of virtual reality and offer a criticism on it through the employment of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's concept of the mental state called flow. This is to argue that certain video games, described only by Chalmers in his article as virtual worlds lacking immersiveness, are also immersive as they trigger in their users the said mental state, which is described as deep engagement or immersion. The concept of freedom and choice will also be explored as another factor in understanding immersiveness. Significance of the study. This research will broaden the understanding, perception, and conception of virtual reality and our experience of it. This study is also another step towards a philosophical understanding or inquiry towards video game addiction, which is most prevalent in most teens and young adults in our society today. This philosophical inquiry also expands the application of Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, which was originally applied to more physical activities. This means that the concept of flow applies to physical reality and non-physical realities. This endeavor is also in line with the research thrust of St. Paul Seminary Foundation Incorporated in providing a means for people to be able to make wise choices in the use of social communication platforms such as virtual reality. Lastly, this research enriches the understanding of consciousness and its corresponding mental states and the relationship between philosophy and psychology as two separate yet closely intertwined disciplines which inquire into the human psyche. Method. This study is a qualitative analysis on the concept of virtual reality applied to video games, employing existing data from excellent works of David Chalmers, particularly his 2018 article, The Virtual and the Real, which is an excerpt from his work Disputatio. This research aims to expand the understanding of virtual reality by involving pertinent psychological concepts such as Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow in particular, and the element of choice and freedom, in order to understand a person's immersive experience in video games. This research will critique Chalmers' claim that video games such as World of Warcraft and other similar video games are non-immersive virtual worlds and do not fall under the category of virtual reality proper due to its lack of immersiveness. Research structure. For the first question, the researcher will employ a descriptive historical method. The researcher will expose immersion and investigate such concept and ascertain the effect of the psychological factor called flow and the element of choice and freedom in the immersive experience and expand the understanding of immersion. To proceed with the next discussion, the researcher will again employ a descriptive historical method in exposing and underlining David Chalmers' concept of immersiveness in virtual reality. The researcher will first explore and explain David Chalmers' concept of virtual reality and then move on to this concept of virtual reality proper, as expressed in his article The Virtual and the Real. Chalmers' concept of virtual reality proper involves three elements: immersive, interactive, and computer generated. Here, immersive means the ability to give the user a sense of presence in the game. For Chalmers, non-immersive virtual reality are designated merely as virtual worlds. The research will then delve and criticize the concept of immersion according to David Chalmers as a central focus of the study. Lastly, the researcher will offer a synthesis of possible critiques to Chalmers' concept of immersiveness and virtual reality by looking into the concepts explored during the preceding discussions. Definition of terms. This study will be guided by the definitions of the following terms. Reality refers to the quality or state of being real. Virtual reality, VR, is a form of reality which simulates real-life affairs through the use of computers and digital information technology. Virtual reality proper, VRP, refers to a grade or degree of VR which is comprised of the following elements: immersive, interactive, and computer generated. Computer generated refers to virtual worlds being supported and created through the use of computer systems. Interactive is a characteristic of VR which allows the user to make an impact on the virtual environment and the progression of its story. Immersive refers to one of the elements of VRP which gives the user a sense of presence in the virtual environment. Virtual world refers to a simulated environment where most events in VR take place. Presence is a perception of continuity between the physical world and the virtual world. Flow is a mental state described by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi as the optimal experience, which is characterized by intense focus on an activity. Scope and limitation. This research will involve David Chalmers' concept of virtual reality as expressed in his article The Virtual and the Real, and the relevant psychological concept of flow as described by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. David Chalmers is a philosopher of mind whose works involve concepts in psychology, and so it may be used to scrutinize parts of his theory. This research will also involve the concepts of immersive gameplay in virtual reality games, and as an extension, conventional desktop video games, which is defined by Chalmers as virtual worlds. Likewise, the study will focus on these so-called immersive virtual worlds and not include arcade games and other console games, which are not immersive virtual worlds such as Tetris and the like. The discussion will also only focus on the immersive aspect of virtual reality and will not discuss the other two elements, which are interactive and computer generated, as these two concepts have been thoroughly described by David Chalmers and a certain level of consensus has been reached among researchers on the definition of these two concepts. Lastly, the research will include works of other authors on the element of human freedom and choice in the use of mass communication platforms. Data gathering procedure. The researcher will make use of PDF file version of David Chalmers' article The Virtual and the Real, obtained from online from ResearchGate. The research will also make use of printed materials, books, and journals available at the St. Paul Seminary Library and the Mission Society of the Philippines Seminary Library for sources on psychology. Likewise, due to lack of the availability of printed copies and studies related to flow, virtual reality, and video games. The research will also make use of PDF and internet sources available in the websites such as ResearchGate, LiveGen.org, and Plato Stanford Encyclopedia. The researcher will also include personal correspondence with David Chalmers through email, which happened in the course of the completion of the study. David Chalmers' email was obtained by the researcher through Chalmers' personal website. Results and discussions. In this chapter, the researcher will discuss the topics relevant to the questions raised in the previous chapter. The flow of the discussion is as follows. First, the researcher will discuss different perspectives of immersiveness in virtual reality, using writings from the critiques of Chalmers' concept and other parallel writings with applications of virtual reality in other fields such as education and psychology. Next, the concept of immersiveness in virtual reality by David Chalmers will be discussed, starting from his own definition of virtual reality down to the three elements of virtual reality, which he presented in his article, The Virtual and the Real, towards the more specific elements of immersive, which is the main point of discussion in this research. Lastly, the researcher will critique Chalmers' definition of immersive using such concepts as flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and choice and freedom as other major factors in the immersiveness of virtual reality. Number 1. Immersiveness in virtual reality. The term virtual reality, VR henceforth, may be understood as another form of reality, which is real enough in essence but not admitted as formal reality. According to William R. Sherman and Alan B. Craig in their book Understanding Virtual Reality, Interface, Application, and Design, there are four key elements of virtual reality experience, namely virtual world, immersion, sensory feedback, and interactivity. Virtual world is defined as an imaginary space that independently exists from the real world. The medium used to create the space is, of course, simulation made of visual elements rendered with computer graphics. Imaginary space refers to the fact that virtual reality is not physical in nature and that the space being projected occupies space as in our notion of physical space. Virtual worlds are visual elements rendered with computer graphics. All that makes up virtual worlds are just bundles of digital information which are being processed and supported by computers. In other words, a virtual world is an environment which is simulated by computer systems and graphics and provides habitation for the user while in virtual reality. Sensory feedback is when the input here is as close to reality as possible. To move around, users don't press a button, they actually move around. This means that in the current virtual reality technology, the way we move in the real world is reflected in the way we move in the virtual world. It is crucial for one to sensibly experience the virtual world in the same manner as one sensibly experiences the physical world. If that is not the case, the seamlessness of the experience falters, and this does not add well to the experience. Lastly, interactivity means that virtual reality has digital objects in which activities may be engaged with in the virtual environment. According to Laszlo Ropolyi, in his article entitled Virtuality and Reality Toward a Representation of Ontology, the reality of virtual reality depends on the concept of presence. For Ropolyi, presence is understood as a sort of perceptual illusion of non-mediation of the user of VR. In the user's experience of the virtual environment, there is a continuous and seamless flow of sensory information. The immersiveness of a certain technology then can actually be a product of a person's subjective experience of that technology. Key to the immersiveness is if and when the user has felt the sense of presence. This perception of being there is entirely upon the interpretation and perception of a person using virtual reality. We have discussed the definition of immersive in the extant literature on virtual reality, and we looked into the different perspectives being laid down by different writers and researchers of virtual reality. The next part of our discussion will primarily focus on Chalmers' concept of immersive and the salient points of the immersive facet of virtual reality proper. Number 2. David Chalmers' concept of immersiveness in virtual reality. David Chalmers claims that events in virtual reality are real, virtual objects are also real, and that virtual reality is genuine reality. According to him, I will defend the opposite view. Virtual reality is a sort of genuine reality. Virtual objects are real objects, and what goes on in virtual reality is truly real. He calls this position virtual realism, which, according to him, is loosely inspired by Michael Himes' 1998 book of the same name, which also talks about virtual reality and the impact it has on his users. In his article, The Virtual and the Real, Chalmers lists three essential elements of virtual reality, namely immersion, interaction, and computer generation. David Chalmers defines immersive by saying that an immersive environment is one that generates perceptual experience of the environment from a perspective within it, giving the user the sense of presence, that is, the sense of really being present at that perspective. Chalmers writes, typically, this involves inputs that yield a visual experience as of a three-dimensional environment. Chalmers, in a reply to an email sent by the researcher of the study, specifies that immersive is with respect to 3D perceptual sense relevant to VR proper. In simple words, immersive is characterized by the stimulation of the visual experience of an individual user along with the auditory and sensory experiences. However, Mel Slater does not agree in using the terms immersive and presence interchangeably or with seemingly equal meanings. Slater says that immersion must be used in a more objective point of view, as in the immersive is a product of what the technology can deliver. Presence, on the other hand, is entirely subjective. Chalmers concedes that virtual reality is a very broad term and may be defined by others differently. He gives distinctions in order to emphasize what he calls virtual reality proper, VRP, from what is generally considered as virtual reality. For Chalmers, virtual reality proper is VR which satisfies all three of the above mentioned elements. He considers that these three are the primary and most important definitive properties or elements of virtual reality proper. He makes this distinction as other related technologies which cater to non-standard means of generating experiences as of an external environment may also be considered as virtual reality. Less standard virtual reality, or non-virtual reality proper, non-VRP, may satisfy just one of the three given elements and may be considered as a form of VR. One representative example of these non-VR are non-immersive desktop video games as traditional computer games such as Counter-Strike, the Sims franchise, the Total War series, World of Warcraft, and Dota 2, to name a few. These computer games make use of the desktop monitor and keyboard and mouse hooked to a system unit as a means to control or move within the virtual world inhabited by the user's avatar. The usual method or mode of interaction used in these games are the older and usual way, hence the term traditional computer games. Current VR technology gives the user a sense of free movement within the virtual world inasmuch as perceptual experience is concerned, since the aim of current VR technology is to give an accurate parallel of one's experience in the virtual world as with one's experience in the real world. All these discussed concern only the non-immersive desktop computer games and does not discuss other non-VRP technologies such as immersive 3D films and other non-interactive technologies, which has elements relevant to one or two of the elements mentioned above by Chalmers, which are relevant to what he calls virtual reality proper. Number 3. Critique on Chalmers' concept of immersiveness and virtual reality. The element of immersion in VR has thus been so far limited to the aspect of 3D perceptual experience. However, in the following discussion of flow and freedom of choice, we can find out that 3D perceptual experience being offered by VR technology is not the sole marker or indicator of immersion in VR technology as proposed by David Chalmers, and that individual mental experiences must also be taken account as well as the agency of the VR user. Flow is a state of mind occurring when certain factors have been satisfied in the process of doing an activity. This concept was introduced by the Hungarian-American psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in the year 1975 and is characteristically described as a state in which a person is intense focus on a certain activity. The element of focus is of great importance because during flow, attention is freely invested to achieve a person's goals because there is no disorder to strengthen out or no threat for the self to defend against. According to Prochi and Bowers in their study entitled An Examination of Flow and Immersion in Games, They discovered a potential overlap between immersion and flow in examining the answers of the students they investigated after they were playing video games. According to Tommy Otzen, playing and gaming are two different yet related constructs wherein play is defined as a stage wherein a player enters into agreement with the conditions of the play's make believe world. In this condition, imagination is crucial and is a major requirement. In a typical computer game, these elements of playing and gaming are relevant and crucial. Players must first come to terms with the conditions set forth by the game. Different games would have different set conditions or themes. The player is brought to these worlds through the player's own participative imagination. In the case of David Chalmers' elements of immersion in VRP, Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow might expand the definition of the said element. David Chalmers proposes that immersion is the ability of a VR technology to give the user a 3D perceptual experience of the virtual world, and that is crucial for that technology to be considered as VRP. However, we must remember that immersion may also be understood to include the subjective experience of the user, which is being expressed in flow episodes occurring in individuals who are engaged even in those computer games which Chalmers does not consider to be VRP. Freedom to choose is one crucial aspect of users of VR technology, and the corresponding consequences to their choices also matter. For the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, humans have the power to do or not to do. This means that a person has the ability to discern the effects of one's own actions, and from the outcome of such a discernment, a person can decide whether to act accordingly or not. This encapsulates the proposition that for every conscious choice of any individual person, that same person is held responsible for the consequences of such choices. The English philosopher John Locke also treats choices as a central innate character of any being with agency. He writes of his concepts of action and forbearance. He postulates that freedom is the ability or power of any agent to do or not to do an action, according to one's mental discernment of whether it is preferable to do or not to do an action. David Hume has a similar construct of will and choice as crucial to liberty. Hume argues that free actions are a product of the agent's willingness and desires. He further states that responsibility falls on the person doing a certain action, as it was the person's willing and desire that served as the determining factor of the action. Using the definition of freedom from these three philosophers, we can say that the conscious, premeditated, willful action of an individual, free from any external influence or coercion and impediment to do such actions, constitutes the freedom in the choices made by any individual. These might imply that immersion could also be a product instead of a person's willful action to engage in virtual reality, rather than virtual reality being innately immersive. Conclusion. The concept of immersion must be understood in a wider sense as opposed to its initial definition. A particular way of understanding immersion is through the use of relevant psychological concepts such as flow and the philosophical concepts of consciousness and subjective experience. In doing so, immersion can be understood as a state of mind of an individual engaged in virtual reality and going deeper than the physiological aspects of perception. In the concept of consciousness, the quality of an experience remains to be a subjective matter, and the realness of virtual reality remains to be a quality of individual mental experiences. Recommendations. The researcher recommends a further investigation in David Chalmers' concept of virtual reality proper in order to expand our understanding of VRP and its elements and concepts, particularly the concepts of interaction and computer generation. VRP, consciousness, and reality are closely related topics which might be a suitable area for further study. The researcher also recommends to study the implication of consensual hallucination, coined in the book Neuromancer written by William Gibson, in the use of video games as the elements of make-believe as prerequisite to playing these games, as proposed in the study made by Tommy Otzen. The researcher likewise recommends to view other interactive computer-generated environments, such as Facebook and other social media, as another form of virtual reality. Lastly, the researcher recommends to explore and investigate the ethical implication of the use of virtual reality in social communication, particularly in the part of interpersonal communication and the substitution of physical meetups in favor of online or virtual meetups between individuals and among groups. Thank you for patiently listening. I am now open for your questions.